You're watching Digestion in Life, Getting to the Root Cause of Digestive Disorders by Dr. Alyssa Gall on Resonance Wellness TV, part of our Whole Life Medicine Alleviate series. Keep in the loop about future webinars and events on whole-life-medicine.com. So good evening and welcome to this seminar on Digestion in Life, Getting to the Root Cause of Digestive Disorders. As you can well imagine, this is a fairly comprehensive topic, and in essence, we're going to cover to the best of my ability basically the main things that I want to communicate to you about digestion, about the potential troubles that we can have in our digestion, and what some of the basic approaches to that are. But we're also going to talk about more extensive information and also talk about some of the symbolism of what happens to us when we have digestive disorders, because as those of you who know me well know, really I don't separate anything that's happening in your body from what's happening in your life, either now or in the past. And so we're going to also take a look a little bit at that symbolism. So without further ado, let's just get started. So the first thing I wanted to do is just read you a couple of interesting quotes. The first one is, most people eat too much. They live from a quarter of what they eat, and physicians live from the rest. That is an old Egyptian philosophy quote. So they lived quite a few thousand years ago. So I'm having this sneaking suspicion that this has not been a problem since just modern times. The second one is one out of Chinese philosophy that says the belly is the middle point of life. 100 different diseases have their origin there. And in Chinese medicine, the digestion is really central to all the processes that are going on in the body, and that's the way that they actually have the organ relationships set up. And lastly here, there's a quote from a Dr. F.X. MAYR. Now we're going to talk about him just a tiny bit in a few slides, but he had said toxins in the intestines are the cause of illness, premature aging, and ugliness of the physical body, and ugliness of the psyche and soul. So hopefully not everybody feels too ugly with their digestive problems, but I think he's not really far off. He also said therapy applied in time causes a beneficial change. So we're going to go with that as well. So as all of you already know, hopefully you do, maybe you're brand new on some of these webinars, our lecture on digestion today is coming under Alleviate from the Whole Life Medicine model, which is the first step in health strategy at Resonance Wellness. And Alleviate is really the first step in my approach to patient guidance. So when we talk about feeding ourselves, we're talking about the starting points of Alleviate in the WLM model. And in short, there's 3 considerations when we're looking at strategies to resolve a health issue in Alleviate. The first is to consider what the root causes are in our health situation. So to ask ourselves, what's the setup? And diet is a chief lifestyle intervention in any natural health plan for both prevention and treatment of disease. And so when we make changes to diet or a digestion process, we're really affecting how things are set up to operate biologically. The second is to look at the state of the tissues involved, pardon me, and in the clean slate process, we're looking at how to improve cleaning up tissues that get bogged down. You know, in particular in digestion, because it is part of our detoxification system, and with any digestive intervention, you're going to see improved maintenance of body tissues and much better tissue cleanup. And lastly, having a good digestion really helps you to obtain missing ingredients for all of your metabolic needs and repair needs in your body. And so the quality and nature of how you are digesting what you eat can play a big role. And of course, with those in mind, there's problem-specific programs for particular conditions digestively. So let's dive in with those thoughts in mind and take a look a little bit at how we're going to proceed. So first and foremost, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the organs of digestion, how each organ works, what the organ metaphor is, habits that really help that organ or system, the functional digestive complaints of that organ, and if there's digestive diseases in that organ. I'm also going to talk a little bit about testing strategies for when things are having enough difficulty that you're really going to need a little bit more information than what just your feedback is like. So everybody's probably learned about the organs of digestion at some point in school. I remember my favorite thing ever was like third grade. Our school had one of those body models, where the organs and stuff come out. I haven't seen one of those in the school in eons. I don't know if any of you remember that, or if you have kids that have schools that have that. But I was fascinated by all that stuff that was packed in the abdomen. And maybe that's why I became a doctor. Not really sure. But in any case, these are the acknowledged organs of the digestion. So mouth and esophagus. The esophagus is the tube that runs down from your throat to your stomach. You obviously swallow and move a bolus of food down it. The stomach, which is next in line. The liver, gallbladder, and pancreas, which actually dump into the first section of the small intestine. The small intestine itself, the large intestine or colon, and then the rectum. So we're going to just take a look first at some really interesting. I just want to insert a slide here that's kind of interesting things to consider. So you guys have probably never seen me show a diagram exactly like this, because a lot of the time I describe this in words when you're around. But in essence, what this diagram is talking about are the circulation beds, the main circulation beds in your body. And obviously in the middle of this, we're seeing like the lungs and the heart and the trunk of the body as being one major group of circulations. But then if you look in the bottom part of this diagram, you'll see that there's another set of major circulations going through the digestion and liver. And you'll see that the digestion is the first bed, and then that feeds into the bed of the second of the liver there. And then everything returns back. The blue stuff is the deoxygenated and sometimes denutriented blood, although that's not marked on this diagram. You'll also see that there's a major set of beds through the kidneys. And then you'll also see that there's a major bed through the pelvis and legs. And that'll include sections of the very bottom of your digestion. So why I want to show this is because there's a lot of circulation that's going through your digestive system. And of course, we've talked probably at length about how you can shut down certain circulatory beds and create problems in a zone. So, and we're going to talk about this energetically in the next slide, but if you have an impairment in circulation where you're not getting good blood flow through some of these things, some of these areas, you're obviously not going to get oxygen-rich blood flow through it. And you're not going to get great blood flow out either. So the nervous system actually controls the circulation, particularly just prior to those beds, just prior and just after those purple circulation beds. And under stress, people tend to decrease the flow, especially through these lower three, because, well, maybe not so much through the very bottom one, but you're going to change it under stress because you want to shunt blood to the muscles in order to get ready to run. So if your nervous system is carrying a stress pattern in one of these zones, you actually are really going to have an impact on how resilient some of these repair mechanisms actually are and how well you're bringing things in from your nutrition. So poor flow in or poor flow out makes for poor conditions. And remember, one of the flows that's also there alongside of this, even though it's not marked in this diagram, are the lymphatics, which are obviously a major part of your immune system. And especially in this third zone, there are a ton of lymphatics going all the way through the mesentery, which we're going to see up close and personal in a few slides. But I just want you to kind of start to see this in your head as really being a ton of circulation. I don't know if any of you have caught the Body Worlds exhibits that have passed through town. At the moment, there's an Animal Worlds exhibit at the Science Center, and they have several models of the circulation beds of animals. And in particular, in this show, they have one of a dog, and they show, because they've injected all the capillary beds, they actually show just how much blood is in a tissue. It's so much blood that you obviously can know that it's a dog, even though nothing is there in front of you except for the injected capillary beds. It's absolutely fascinating. We just tend to think of the big tubes as kind of being our circulation system, but the vast majority of our circulation are in these little tiny capillary beds that are represented here in purple, and don't nearly do justice to how many tiny one blood cell thick vessels there actually are. So that's all the way through an organ, and of course, some organs even more richly than others. So the lungs are an example. If you see a lung with that kind of injection, of course, you'd be absolutely stunned to see it, how many vessels there are. So given that, then we'll take a look at the energetic areas of digestion. So in your digestion, we kind of roughly divide the abdomen into 3 chakra areas. And in my mind, of course, there's the energetics of that, but then there's also the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system aspects of that. So the 3rd chakra, which is the one that's right underneath your diaphragm and above your belly button, that's kind of the area of the 3rd chakra, and that's the stomach, the gallbladder, the liver, and the pancreas. And this really relates life-wise to the power relationships and boundaries that we have with other people. So how good are you at setting boundaries? How aggressive are you when you don't get your way? How passive are you if you feel like you're getting pushed? How much do you hold into anger or resentment or anxiety or inferiority? We're going to look at some of those pieces as we're going along. The 2nd chakra is roughly the small intestine and the large intestine. It's also the adrenal and the kidney, but of course we're talking about digestion here, but that you can't really separate that out. And it's really relating to how you use your personal power. So how are you going to be of service? Are you going to be of service to everybody else first and then have no juice left for yourself? That's a very common thing in our culture. Are you going to push yourself so that you get everything done perfectly and you're a slave to your own perfectionism? Those sort of things tend to have a high correlating factor with certain digestive disorders. And last but not least, in the 1st chakra, so closer to the rectal tissues and the last piece is the large intestine, that really can relate to how safe you feel in the world and in your foundation. So in finances, relationships, job, anything like that. So it can also be like frank, like safety issues as well. So we're going to take a look at things kind of from this perspective while we're also looking at function and symptoms through the digestion. So just to be clear, I wanted to make the difference between metabolism and digestion clear. So the metabolism is how you take the food you eat and turn it into cell fuel. So this is past the digestive process in the cells, mostly of the muscles, but obviously every cell is metabolizing to an extent. But in those cellular areas, metabolic enzymes that are really read directly off of your DNA mediate a whole process of conversions that take the fuel substances that you're feeding towards the cell compartments and make them into ATP, or your major fuel for your cells. And of course, ATP is the universal fuel. You need it to drive many of the reactions that are going on in the body. And the right fuel mixtures and the right fuel types or selections make a huge difference in your metabolism. Many of you may have heard of metabolic typing. That's something where we're actually trying to match the person to their ideal diet so that these metabolic mechanisms that you inherit, that we're feeding the ones that you do best. So that can have a very broad effect on people in all sorts of different conditions. Now, of course, digestion is still a crucial part of getting those fuels into the metabolism. The digestion is really the breakdown of food in the gastrointestinal tract. And of course, the enzymes that we typically think of are the digestive enzymes. They're part of that process. Of course, they're not the only part. They're one subset of many digestive fluids that we're going to discuss today, but it's a breakdown process where certain things have to meet a certain level of processing. If you actually I'm hoping that none of you have had wartime experiences, but one of the things that often is burned into a soldier's memory is if they have been exposed to a person who's had their guts ruptured by injury, and what kind of issues forth from a wound like that is really the most horrendous smell you could ever imagine in your life. And the reason for that is that digestive processes are incredibly destructive processes. And so much is going on in the GI that is really, for the most part, in most healthy human beings, you're completely unaware of how much sulfurous processes are going on in there. And so I hope nobody ever has that experience, but it's certainly a shocking one if you've never smelled that before. But I just think it's very interesting how dramatic that is, because I think we underappreciate as human beings just how much violent breakdown there really is in those zones. Now, I wanted to start by talking about digestion starting in the mouth. Chewing is vastly underrated. It really is. It really helps break down food. It improves the swallowing reflexes. It helps the esophagus when you actually chew. It enhances, actually, it's one of the main enhancers for taste, and it helps direct digestive secretions. So, as an example, when you put things in your mouth, there are neurological feedbacks from the chemistry of what you're putting in your mouth that immediately informs the upper digestion of what's coming, so that the secretions that match what's coming are going to be selectively up or down regulated. To smell and taste, you need to have food chemicals suspended in saliva. So when you don't have enough mucous membrane hydration and you don't have enough saliva, you cut down the taste of it and also the smell. So when people have poor hydration or poor mucous membrane function, it usually extends all the way up into the top of the nose, and there'll be marked changes in smell and taste. So good chewing suspends those molecules and actually increases the amount of taste pretty dramatically. Most people don't seem to chew a lot anymore. And we're going to talk about something in a moment that's you're going to find interesting about chewing, a couple of stories. But signs of inadequate chewing include burping a lot, so where you're not breaking things down enough to really meet the next process of digestion, farting a lot. In fact, a lot of people swallow air. We'll talk about that. Bloating, because you haven't done step one particularly well. The feeling of indigestion that people kind of give vaguely, like you eat something, it just feels not right, including stomach aches, heartburn, and cramping, especially obviously in the upper digestion, but just as well in the lower digestion. And in fact, it often sets us up for conditions to not be right at multiple levels. Now, like I said, you need to produce saliva, and you produce a lot of it, like a liter per day, which is amazing and kind of gross all at the same time. So you have three major pairs of salivary glands and a few minor ones too throughout your mouth. And the first pair of saliva glands are the parotids. These are the ones that if they're swollen with mumps virus, that's how you get the big fat cheeks. Now, what the parotids secrete is a serous solution. So it's a clear, watery solution that has amylase in it. Amylase is also known as pitolin. That's a digestion of carbohydrate enzyme. And so the ducts for those are actually near your upper teeth, and it just kind of drips down. The sublingual glands are located under the tongue, and they produce a saliva that's mostly mucus. So mucousy saliva is more thick, it's a little bit more gluey, and it binds the chewed up food into like a ball or a bolus, and it lubricates the esophagus. So the ducts for those glands are located on the floor of your mouth, and a lot of the time you'll be most aware of those ones. There's also submaxillary glands or submandibular glands near your jawbone, and they actually secrete both serous and mucus saliva. But a lot of the ducting is still under the tongue. So when you chew and mix with saliva carbohydrates, you'll start some of the carbohydrate digestion right in the mouth. And if you eat a bunch of protein-rich things, you just don't have as much amylase being produced. So your body is adapting depending on what's going on in your mouth. Saliva is also a good first defense against bacterial infections. So when you chew food well and you create a lot of surface area, there's you can kill a lot more bacteria that way. So it's a protective mechanism. There's also bicarbonate in saliva that can activate cellulose digesting enzymes called cellulases that are found in raw vegetables. So obviously, you have to chew and digest a lot more to break down a raw vegetable, but chewing well, there's some built-in mechanisms for that. And even if you're having soup or pureed stuff, you should actually still be salivating over that, like holding it in your mouth a little bit, and not just sucking it back, not mixed in your mouth. So swish it a little bit before you swallow, because you'll start this whole process. Now, like I said, I was going to tell a couple of stories, and this story was told to me years ago when I was training with another physician, and he had told the story of a doctor in the camp. And I can't find my reference on this. I used to have it. I just don't have it anymore. But the story he told was this, that there was a physician who was in an internment camp during the Second World War. And during the internment, the daily rations were 2 pieces of bread and water. And so he challenged the people who were with him in his area of the camp to spend a lot of time chewing. And how he encouraged them to do that is he actually gave away his second piece of bread to the person who could chew the longest. And it was said that the people in his barracks survived the longest time out of like in comparison to many other camp divisions, not just in that camp, but in other camps. And I'm not sure exactly how they know that, or if they noted it someplace, but most of the people, most if not all of the people in his part of the concentration camp survived. And the theory is because he made them so conscious of just taking every last bit of nourishment out of that bread and not just gobbling it down. Because one of the things that you'll see starving people do is they just can't stop themselves from stuffing themselves. So in a famine situation, this is also not a great idea. But it gives you just a sense of the power of chewing. And it was such a marked story. It hit me so much when I first learned that. I just thought, I am never going to forget that, because that's an important piece of information, as it is to you. Now, I said I was going to talk about Dr. MAYR, who I gave the quote from in the very beginning. And Dr. MAYR, he died in 1965. He's no longer alive. But he was a physician who really was one of the early proponents of using cleansing diets. And, it's interesting because MAYR cure still exists in the world. There are many MAYR cure trained physicians. We don't have very many of them in North America, because North Americans kind of have very interesting ideas about diet in comparison to Western Europe, where there's much more of an emphasis on resting and cures that take time from people, meaning that they actually, like, I trained in spa medicine in Western Europe. That is something that just does totally not exist here. And I don't mean like the spa treatments that you get at the hairdressing salon, like as a beauty treatment. I mean, as a health modality. I trained in a spa town called Carlo Vivari, and also in a number of other places that I got to tour in Germany and Switzerland And I learned things about medicine that are just not used here. And it's just partially cultural. Many countries in Western Europe will pay for people to go on what's called a spa cure or spa. It's a kind of vacation, but it's not really a vacation, because since you go and you do therapies and dietary strategies and you rest on purpose for an extended period of time without media, without any of those things, lots of hands-on therapies, lots of walking up and down the promenade, drinking different kinds of mineral waters that are basically in public springs down the promenade. At least in Karlovy Vary, there's I think there's 13 springs down the promenade. And you would sometimes stay literally in an inpatient hotel that's more like an apartment block attached to the hydrotherapy facilities underneath. So a wildly different type of healthcare system. Same in Germany. I visited Baden-Baden, which is, it means bath in German. This is actually the headquarters of Heal, the homeopathic company. Many of you have probably taken Heal remedies over the years. And they have just beautiful public and medical bath systems there. So it's not just a bath, it's a therapy. But MAYR kind of was in this at some of its highest times when people actually went to take a cure, basically, as one of the only options for their health, because lots of the modern medicine hadn't been developed yet. And he developed a way of doing a cure that was literally teaching people how to cleanse by improving chewing dramatically, and eating slowly, and drinking around the meals but not with the meal. We'll talk about that in a sec. And a lot of the what they actually fed them was like a bread roll. That's what like their small breakfast would be. They were also often given like Epsom salts orally, or magnesium salts orally. They did therapy baths, and manual abdominal treatments. What you're seeing here is a picture are the drawings that were made that showed the postural changes that people would have if their digestion was poor. And so you can see 3 outlines of women here and then 3 outlines of men with various postures and abdominal protrusions. And the MAYR cure, there's kind of categories that people fall into depending on what they kind of look like, even from the side, and what their abdominal organs look like hanging out of their abdomen. So it's fascinating. Of course, nobody here has ever heard of this, and you'd be hard pressed to find a MAYR physician here. But there are full clinics. I've visited the main MAYR clinic in Germany, and it's incredible. So as a metaphor for chewing, we have lots of metaphors for chewing. We're like, I'm chewing on it. I bit off more than I can chew. I'm ruminating over it. The daily grind. We have a lot of these. And, we have this kind of idea of what the chewing metaphor actually is, that you kind of have to be able to actually process through on the first step. And so that those metaphors are absolutely accurate. So if you find yourself saying those things, it might be worth looking at your chewing. Now, you can have lots of problems with chewing. You can have dental issues that prevent you from chewing properly and can really actually affect your digestion if you're forced to chew on one side of your mouth, as an example. Jaw alignment, too. If people's jaw is in a poor position for musculoskeletal reasons or because of TMJ, that could be an issue. And poor saliva production. So if somebody has Sjogren's, which is basically an autoimmune disease that partially can attack the saliva glands and decrease the amount of relative saliva that you have available to you, or Sicca, which is basically just dry mucous membranes, this can all create problems with the normal chewing processes. I'm sure everybody's like thinking about chewing right now for like at least next week. You're all going to think about chewing. Okay, so let's look at the stomach. So the stomach is a really interesting organ because most people have no clue what the stomach actually does, and they assume that a lot of your digestion actually happens in your stomach. But guess what? It doesn't. In fact, it's really majorly a preparatory step. So what the stomach does is you chew up your food and you stick it in that big cavern right there. And what it does is it secretes acid. So it actually secretes hydrochloric acid. And so ideally, it's the actual pH of hydrochloric acid proper is about 0.8. But what you put enough hydrochloric acid on the food to make the pH in your stomach usually between about 1 to 3, and ideally below 2. So pH is a log scale. That means that for every digit up or down is 10 times as. So water is considered neutral at 7. And so 10 times as to get down to pH 2 is substantially more acidic. 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 more acidic. And so it's actually a bag that is designed for that kind of acidity. So if somebody says to you, you have too much acid in your stomach, don't believe them, because that's not really possible. Now, you can have a damaged stomach that doesn't like the acid, and you can have other problems that create issues with acidity, but it's not the acid itself that's the problem. That is the whole reason for your stomach to exist. And it's actually also secreting a pretty major mucus layer that we're going to see here in a moment. So when you put things in the stomach, you are really just dissociating proteins. So as a broad category, there's fats, carbs, and proteins. And what acid does is it unwinds big fat proteins. So these are protein structures here. The one on the far right is basically a quaternary structure. That means different proteins that are glued together loosely by bonds. And then if you go one to the left, that's a tertiary structure. That means it's a big long ribbon that's been folded up. Then when you look at the one left of that, that's a secondary structure. So it's a kind of twist to a long string. And then you see amino acids. So basically proteins are chains of amino acids, and they get folded 2, 3, 4 times over. And what the acidity in your stomach actually does is it starts to dissolve all the way down to the secondary structure. So you're basically taking something that really roughly looks like a ball of yarn, compacted yarn, and you're unwinding it into a pile of string. And then there's a handful of enzymes in there that are going to start to do protein chain digestion. So at certain sites, pepsin will actually cut some of those ribbons. In essence, that's almost all that the stomach does. So it's liquefying. If you chewed well and you're mixing things with acid well, you're basically getting a liquid slurry of the things that you've eaten. If you throw up and there's a lot of like not really great digestive, I mean, I'm not asking you to throw up to experiment with this, but if you throw up and you see a lot of chunky stuff, it means you didn't chew very well. You know, and most of the time, if you shouldn't really see too much identifiable stuff, ideally. So like I said, maybe not an experiment for today, but so when you look at the stomach lining, people are really, they think about their stomach lining kind of like sensitive, like their eyeballs, but it's really not like that. It's a very tough columnar epithelium. This is an electron micrograph of, so this is high photography of the cell or the villi that are coming up in the epithelium. And so you can see the structure if you actually cut through it on the side here. So this is what the surface looks like microscopically. And then there's a mucus layer that's over top of it. And so this is just showing you some examples of like the structure of mucus layer. And in essence, the mucus layer, there's a lot. It's basically a highly cross-linked mucin molecule. About 5% is mucin, and about 95% of the mucus layer is water. And it's likely composed of layers and would look or feel a lot like any other biofilm. So biofilm, like if you were in a river and you slipped on a rock, that's a biofilm on the rock. It's highly adherent. You can't just scrape it off. It's a mucus or like a kind of a layer that's structured very, very similarly to what you have on the inside of your stomach. And it's highly protective if it's maintained well. So if you don't have enough acid, it's translating to a poor response from the entire GI tract, because lots of the functions that come next are keyed off of stomach function. So if you actually get your pH down to the right pH, what it actually does is it stimulates the second part of your or the second sphincter on your stomach to open. If you don't have enough acid and your stomach is churning, you can actually shoot contents of your stomach out the looser hole, which is the esophagus, through what's called the cardiac sphincter, which is more like the lid of a garbage can than a true sphincter. This is not like it. Everybody, when I say sphincter, they think about their anal sphincter. That's a true sphincter that has more than one layer of sphincter in it. So the second sphincter on your stomach is a lot more like that. And it opens rhythmically when the pH actually gets low, or otherwise his acidity is high, because the lower the pH, the higher the acidity. So if you don't get enough acid, you can spend a lot of time refluxing things into the looser hole, which is up into your esophagus. And so people mistakenly think that the heartburn problem is that you have too much acid. It's that you don't have enough acid to actually get into the next stage of digestion. And your stomach will try and like hold out until it gets as much acidity as it can. Eventually it'll leak out the contents. But what would normally take 2 to 4 hours can sometimes drag out quite a bit more than that. And you don't want that. So there's lots of metaphors for the stomach. The stomach is the organ of anxiety. And so we hear metaphors like, I can't stomach it, or I don't have the stomach for it. I feel it in the pit of my stomach. It makes me want to puke. People say that person has a fire in their belly. So there are a lot of interesting metaphors. And it's not uncommon, actually, if people are having acute stomach troubles, to have anxiety, or vice versa. And again, it's a bit chicken and eggy. Sometimes the anxiety will come first and it'll bother the organ. Other times the organ itself is having some difficulty and it's being read by your head as being an anxiety problem, or it's being interpreted that way. So people can have, with a gastric ulcer, kind of a vague feeling of anxiety and not realize it's a physical symptom making a mental one, or vice versa. If you are under enough anxiety stress for long enough, as is commonly understood, you can get ulcers. You will say, oh, they were so stressed they got ulcers. And that is true. Now, functionally, like I said, with heartburn, what we're talking about is circumstances where the acidity is really not high enough. And belching tends to be something also very similar, like basically where you're having your stomach contents hanging out for a long time. And instead of, getting on their merry way, you're starting to see kind of putrefaction starting to happen in your stomach. And that releases gas. Now, there's also the possibility of having such poor stomach function that your stomach has actually become colonized with bacteria that really shouldn't be there. Because normally with a normal stomach function, the stomach is pretty sterile most of the time. But if the circumstances are permitting, you can get way more bacteria in there, and then they get to eat the things that you're putting down without much processing, and they can have a heyday and create some very interesting belching problems. And like I said, ulceration is a definite possibility. That's basically where that mucin and water layer are somehow degraded or affected. Now, there's quite a few ways of combating stomach disorders when you know that there's symptoms in the stomach. For one thing, just sit down and relax and eat. Because, you need to be relaxed to get good digestion going. The second thing is make sure your water intake and your salt intake are adequate. I can't tell you the number of times where I've actually helped somebody's heartburn dramatically just by rehydrating them. It's crazy, but it's true, because you need water and salt actually to make acid. And so if you don't have enough of either, you'll do a poor job of acidification, just like you probably also would have done a fairly poor job of saliva production. Now, there's a couple of known agents that you can use to temporarily improve acidity. One of them is betaine hydrochloride. You can take capsules of that with meals if you suspect your stomach function is a bit low, and at least it helps you with a dissociation step. You can also use DGL. That stands for deglycerinated licorice, or ulmus, which is slippery elm. Those both have molecules in them that are very, very similar to mucin. And so as long as there's enough water around and you take those in, it's usually in chewable tablets or powder, work the best for these two herbs, because you want them to actually hit the stomach without having to dissolve a capsule. It's incredibly soothing to the esophagus and the stomach if you can get those mucin-rich herbs in contact with the stomach mucus surface. Next, we'll use a compound that's called zinc carnosine if people are really having difficulty healing the mucous membrane or really the stomach lining. Zinc carnosine is a zinc molecule bound onto a basically amino acid set, and it's one of the most used things in Japan for the incredible amount of anxiety-induced ulceration that they have. Of course, you want to address your anxiety component. Antacids, I mean, sure, if you have this one-off stomach burning because you ate a habanero or something, antacids are temporarily useful. They're not great for long-term use, though, because they will actually neutralize the pH every time you eat one. And so your stomach has to work harder to try and actually get the acid up enough to go with the next process. So it feels good in the moment, but then there are ramifications to that. And you cannot constantly do that. It's not good for your health, and I don't recommend it. NSAID drugs almost always create stomach bleeding, even if you take a small amounts of them. I think the guesstimate is pretty much 95% of the time you're going to get some gastric bleeding, and when you take any form of like ibuprofen, aspirin, basically any NSAID drug. And the Chinese really feel, and the Ayurvedic people really feel, that you should avoid cold drinks with meals. I also suggest that you don't drink a lot with your meals, only because you're watering down the effect of the acidity. So drinking like a glass of water 20 minutes before a meal is a great idea, because you're basically hydrating all those pathways, and you'll basically have absorbed most of that out of your stomach by the time the meal rolls around. But it just makes it harder especially with a large meal, to be putting fluids on top of it. Now, the next thing is your liver and gallbladder. So when you dump the right quality of stomach contents into the duodenum, you get neurological and chemical feedback to your liver and gallbladder. So the liver is the place where you are producing bile, and it's constantly being produced by the liver. So it's a major physical detox pathway from the liver, what you put in bile. So the liver is processing things and then secreting those processed toxins into the bile for elimination. That comes down the common bile duct. So this is in green here. Hope you can kind of see it. It's a little whisper of a green thing. And it actually is a beautiful emerald green as an organ when you open somebody up and take a look at it. And that's because bile actually eventually turns those colors. So it's like a deep emerald green in a cadaver. It's quite interesting to see. But the gallbladder is just a biliary storage organ. So what it does is it stores up the bile so that when you eat a meal that's rich in fats, you contract the gallbladder, dump a whole bunch of bile on the fattiest parts, and bile acts kind of like a soap that suspends fats into tiny little micelles, just like they do in that soap commercial where they put the soap in the middle of the sink and it completely disappears, all the grease disappears. What it's doing is micellizing all of the oils, and that's what your bile actually does in your digestion. The reason being that it needs to be micellized so that all of the fat digesting enzymes can get at all the little micelles. So you will also see here that we've got the pancreas. We're going to talk about the pancreas separately, but you can see it's actually sharing some of the ducting system from the gallbladder into that first section of the duodenum. So this is the first section of small intestine past the stomach. They've cut the stomach out in this particular diagram. So the metaphors for the liver, in Chinese medicine, it's the organ of anger. And we have metaphors like lily liver or what am I, chopped liver, where there's this kind of indignation or passivity. And we have this term in Chinese medicine that's liver qi stagnation, which is kind of this irritability, this PMS-y kind of feeling if liver function is impaired. The gallbladder is actually the organ of resentment. So it's the organ where if there's something that's really bothering you, it isn't unusual to see an increase in gallbladder-oriented symptomatology. The metaphors there are like feeling the bile rise, or yellow-bellied, or sanguine. People have heard the term sanguine, or melancholic. They all apply to the upper digestion in this zone. Now, for liver conditions, like I said, the liver is basically the place where you are doing a lot of your detoxification. And in the liver, you're in essence taking in everything that comes from the digestion first. Your liver gets first pick of everything that you digest. So if you digest well, the liver is really well supplied, and especially if you have a really varied diet, you're going to have great amounts of detoxification agents. If you don't have great detoxification, you can get increases in premenstrual syndrome, headaches or migraines. You get breast tenderness, poor skin appearance, and lots of aggravation of all sorts of common health conditions. You can also have right-sided under the rib cage pains. Not so much pain that that it would bother you enough usually, but just kind of like an ache that you would recognize. Now, if you start to get into a set of conditions where the liver is not adequately supplied, you'll start to see fatty liver appearing, and slowly but surely that progresses to a cirrhosis state. And so this is a picture of a liver with cirrhosis, highly ugly and strangely very hard. So a liver in good condition, if you can float it in a bucket and you will barely be able to feel it. It's a really cool experiment. Also, don't expect you to do this with your own liver, but if you float a healthy liver in a warm bucket of water, it's kind of like a mushroom where like you can kind of feel the top cap, but underneath you feel no resistance. And that's because in the normal conditions, a liver is a watery bag, and it's full of all these streams of fluid going through it, and it's constantly filtering blood from the systemic circulation, also pulling in things from the portal circulation that's from the digestion, transporting things, detoxifying things. There's 5 streams basically that are going through the liver. And so when it becomes unhealthy, though, it goes from the state of having this beautiful fluidity to it to becoming very hard and not very movable. And you can imagine that doesn't go well. Now, the liver is actually quite overbuilt, and it can regenerate itself if it's damaged or if you have to take a piece of it out. It's the only organ that can do that. And it's because it has, if it's in health, such incredible juicy forces. So cool picture of hard livers. So when you know that or suspect that there's some liver function issues, and there can be lots of reasons why you suspect that. Maybe you have the ache in the liver, or your skin is really poor condition, like you have a chronic eczema that's not working really well for you skin-wise, or there's clearly hormonally oriented symptomatology, or if you've had a long-standing digestive disorder. This happens a lot where people have had poor digestive function over such a long period of time that they start to get livery symptoms across the board. And like I said, the liver is really supported by great nutrition created by excellent digestion. There are foods that actually stimulate the liver to work a little bit harder or move things through a bit better, like beets. Beets will usually make the bile dump out a little more rapidly. Jerusalem artichoke, those you can actually buy seasonally in the grocery store, but you can also get them in herbal form. Carrots, garlic, legumes, onions, eggs, water-soluble fibers like in pear, turmeric, cinnamon, licorice. These are all things that actually are quite supportive to liver function. And you can get a supply-oriented liver cleanse. I'm not sure if you've seen any of the detox lectures I've done. I think we're going to plan to redo detox this year. But detoxification is really about adding things to toxins to make them soluble in bile. So you need all these little molecules. And so sometimes using one of the supply-oriented liver cleanses works really well. The ones that we use preferentially are the Metagenics cleanses. So things like Ultra Clear, Ultra Inflamex, Ultra Meal Cardio 360, Ultra Meal Renew. Many of you may have had some experience with those. They're extremely good at just giving all the bits and bobs your liver needs to fix itself. There are a lot of herbal medicines that actually improve bile function and flow. and to a degree will help detoxification because of that, but it's not usually enough by itself, especially if it's more severe. Herbs like dandelion root, almost everybody's heard of that, or yellow dock or chicory. There's a number of different herbs that we have used, and we have tinctures and teas of all of those in the dispensary. If you like gentle approaches, that can be quite nice to use more long term. We also use lipotropic agents. Those are things that just help move the fats through the liver. So things like choline and betaine, we use betaine kind of independently of betaine hydrochloride. It's called DMG. And then there's methionine, B6, folate, and B12. These are all B vitamins and amino acid factors that your liver absolutely requires for detox. And of course, lots of water. Like I said, it is literally a floating water bag under the best conditions. Now, you can also test. I've put a little boxes here for where there's tests available. You can actually test your detoxification function. And what we do is we actually give you a couple of things to load. Usually we use acetaminophen and caffeine. And we can actually test just how well your liver is doing those detoxification processes. So if there's some question that you have a liver issue or it's playing a more major role than you think, it's totally possible to test it. Usually we can guess, so I don't always do that, but some people like the piece of paper too. And it is interesting data. Now, in gallbladders, like I said, are bile storage organs, but what can sometimes happen is that if you don't eat a lot of the oils or the tastes that actually increase bile stimulation and gallbladder stimulation, you can start to see the bile getting to a saturation point. So bile in the gallbladder will slowly lose water and become more concentrated. And it's thought that that's actually what precipitates the start of a stone. Kind of like if in any supersaturated solution, if you put something that it can crystallize over, it'll start to actually create layers of crystallization, except in this case, it's kind of more fatty stuff that will crystallize out. And so you can get these kind of yellow-green stones. Now, this is a gallbladder that is very full of stones, and most of the time they don't look like this. Gallstones are actually really only dangerous if they're really irritating the inside line of the gallbladder and making it very difficult for it to function, or if a gallstone actually gets stuck in the duct. They have to be a certain size to get stuck in the duct. So sometimes people have one big gallstone in their gallbladder, but it's otherwise functional. It can just be left there by itself. It's not a big deal. But you can get inflammation on the inside lining of the gallbladder from either a stone or not. There don't have to be stones there. Sometimes you just have gravel-ish stuff in your gallbladder that isn't moving. And in my experience, a lot of the time, gallbladder attacks are precipitated by situations where there is a major conflict situation going on, either with oneself or with others in the environment. Some of my most markedly gallbladder-ish cases have been where people have been being in the middle of arguments with people. So if you feel that coming on, there's some piece of that you probably have to address. Now, granted, we can also do a pretty good job of soothing it. The gallbladder is very supported by bitters. So I've written bitters. We don't do a lot of bitters in our diet. In all those spa towns I mentioned before, almost all of them will have like a bitter eau de vie, so like some sort of pre-digestion drink that is super bitter, and it really stimulates the upper digestion and gallbladder, and you just get really good liver and bile flow from that, and you also stimulate the stomach as well. If you're losing weight, always support gallbladder function. Sometimes people can move things out of their body so fast that they get some of these precipitating situations going on. And choline and lecithin are known to improve reduce stones over time, not like overnight, but over months and months to years. You can decrease the size of the stones if something is really bothering you there. But we do use a lot of herbal remedies, like specicol is a great one for decreasing gallbladder pain and improving function. I'm sure many of you have seen that in our dispensary. Now let's take a look at the pancreas. The pancreas is an interesting organ. It's kind of a dual organ because obviously it's involved in diabetes. Most people have heard of the pancreas involved in diabetes. But the other thing that it does is it makes your main digestive enzymes. So that's the lipases, which are fat digesting enzymes, and proteases that are protein digesting enzymes. and also the saccharidases, so complex carbohydrate digestion, those are all coming out of your pancreas. And they're doing so, it also secretes an alkaline fluid that is almost like bicarbonate of soda. And so you're neutralizing the acidity with your pancreatic secretions, and you're dumping enzymes that work best at slightly alkaline pH. So you go from under 2 to above 7, closer to 8 by the time you get to the end of the duodenum. That's this first section of your small intestine. It's an incredible conversion process. So if you do the first step well in the stomach, you actually stimulate the pancreas to do great things for you digestively. If the stomach's not great, the pancreatic enzyme secretion is not going to be great. So sometimes what we'll end up doing is we'll end up using like pancreatic enzymes as a result. The organ of the pancreas is the organ of inadequacy. And so pancreas weaknesses will also come if people just don't feel like they're living fully due to fear. Often we'll use the remedy that I call the remedy for the person who's a killjoy. It's a remedy that's made from all the stages of winemaking. It actually is a stimulant to the pancreas energy to help prevent you from getting to the place where all work and no play, like only giving to yourself or letting yourself having something for yourself if all the other work is done, which of course in most people's lives barely ever happens, because we can always find something else to do, whether it's work or home. And like I said, in essence, if you can help the pancreas by getting the digestion going well. You can use pancreatic enzymes to assist, ideally more temporarily, depends on what's going on with you. And herbal medicines like calendula actually help the pancreas quite a bit. There's a number of different herbs that you can use, but this is one of the most common ones. You can also test to see if the pancreas is functioning well, both independently. You can actually do a serum lipase. That's a blood test that shows how much fat digesting enzyme you're pumping out. That's a good measure of pancreas function. And it's also part of the bigger, more comprehensive digestive and stool analysis panels. So you can see fecal fat to see whether or not you've actually suspended and digested those fats. And of course, that's coming out of the gallbladder system and the pancreas together. So you can actually see how much of a difficulty you're having with that based on those. It's a kind of stool test when we do that. Now, moving on to the small intestine, this is a huge thing. It's roughly 3.5 times your height in length. It is not a tube that can fall out. You know, I've seen the cartoons where like the tube goes flying. It's very, very much bound into your, and attached actually on the inside of your back. So it's a membrane, and here there on the left-hand side, you can see the picture of the mesentery. So this is where all the vessels and stuff supply the tube all the way down. And it's kind of all encapsulated in a membrane that goes over the tube and kind of over both sides of the vessels. So both the arteries and the veins and the lymphatics. And so those membranes are then bunched up and attached in the back. So even if your abdomen wall was to be compromised in some way, the guts can only come out so far. They don't fall out. So they kind of have a lot of mobility though, because that is a serous fluid secreting surface. So it slides against each other. So that's why there's all this motility in there. And mobility is that it's like a tube that can slide against the next thing, kind of like two glass surfaces with fluid in between them, that kind of sliding. Now, obviously, the small intestine is a massive absorptive surface. It's about 250 square meters in absorptive surface. It's huge. Now, there's certain things that can damage this. Here, I've just shown you like the big villi and the microvilli and the epithelial cells. So this is showing you why there's 250 square meters of absorptive surface, is because all the cells have microvilli, and then all of the villi that are on the left here, I mean, this is basically exploded view. That's why it's just a massive amount of surface area. Now, if you are gluten sensitive, like as in celiac disease, or if you've had inflammatory issues in your small intestine, you can damage the villi quite badly and lose a lot of your absorptive surface. And this is one of the biggest problems in chronic celiac without diagnosis, is that you actually start to lose a lot of absorptive surfaces, and it puts you in a malnutrition state due to not having enough surface to actually get what you need out of your food. Now that is not everybody, but just so that you're aware, it's just a massive surface area. It's like a tennis court plus, a big tennis court. Also, the small intestine has a lot of immune tissue. So there is just as many immune cells in your gut as in the rest of your body combined, like so many. So part of the reason for that is, of course, this is a surface that's technically open to the outside world. So everything you swallow, you have to kind of filter through that to see which parts belong in you and which parts don't. And of course, this can also be part of the trouble, because if there's things that aren't digested properly, the immune system can actually get quite triggered by constantly seeing things that are identifiable in the material that's going through your digestion. If you didn't do a great job of digesting it, then your immune system is already going to be super hyped. And what happens as a consequence is there's a lot of inflammatory factors that are dumped. And when you dump all those inflammatory factors, you start to actually change the functional protective devices on the gut wall. And so people have heard about leaky gut, and what that's really referring to is the bindings in between the epithelial cells that normally would prevent things that are undigested from leaking through and hitting the bloodstream, which is literally one cell layer away from that absorptive surface. So if you have a lot of inflammatory damage, you break the tight junctions and you got uncontrolled transmission of things, your immune system goes into overdrive, and then it just kind of starts to perpetuate it after a while. So there's inflammatory mediators, those are coming into your liver's aware that there's inflammation, it has to filter out all this stuff that's not properly dealt with, that overloads all of the detox systems. It's one big vicious circle. So when we find people who have intolerances and things like that, this is often part of the mechanism of the process. So we can do some things to actually improve that. So we can use borage oil. Many of you might have used borage oil before. That's very high in gamma-linolenic acid, and it's part of the structures for gluing back the tight junctions together. There's also a lot of, there's substances that improve repair of the small intestine in general. Glutamine is one of the major ones. There are other kind of related molecules that also help, but glutamine is the main fuel of the enterocytes, so all of those cells that are lining your small intestine. And it turns out that if you feed those cells, because they have such a rapid turnover, it actually improves how easily they repair in general. You can also use probiotics and prebiotics, because the microbiome, the microbiota really do contribute, and we'll just see how much in a few minutes here, to the maintenance of these structures and of immune tolerances in this area. But if you know that you have a small intestine problem, or you tend to have leaky gut, there are certain, like these things are kind of crucial to supporting you. Again, based on the individual, but as categories, those are great supports. Now, obviously, we start to get really interesting phenomena coming out of the GI with respect to food reactions. And not all food reactions are the same. I think we might just do a lecture entirely on food reactions in the next year, because lots of people have some confusion about what is a true allergy versus sensitivity versus a histamine reaction versus like food compound sensitivities like salicylate sensitivities or oral allergy syndromes. There's a number of different things. Now we're starting to see more complex diagnoses being characterized as syndromes like mast cell activation syndromes, and a number of other like interesting subcategories of difficulties with screening and filtering. And really it comes down to poor digestion and boundary destruction. So we'll talk about that in a further lecture if people are interested. Now we're coming down to the bum end, so the colon end. So the colon is mostly about gathering up what you've done in the digestive process and forming stools. So this is not a big digestive place, It is a great place for reabsorption of fluids. And so if you have like a chronic diarrhea based on colon dysfunction or small intestine dysfunction, you can lose a lot of fluids through your colon, unfortunately. It's also a place where you can produce gas. Most people's gas, like 90% of people's average everyday gas, is ingested air and a little bit of bacterial contribution. But it shouldn't be a ton, and it should ideally not be horribly smelly either. But there's lots of interesting pathologies that kind of come with colon function. Now, certainly we think about constipation and diarrhea. Now, that's not just the colon. There's other aspects of motility that are involved in the production of that. But we have this beautiful chart called the Bristol stool chart. Has anybody seen one of these? I actually have a t-shirt with this on it. I got it from a colleague who specializes in poo. Love the shirt. It is brown. And what this is showing is kind of like what the normal poo should look like. So the normal poo is that type 4 there. So it should look like a sausage or a snake. It's smooth and soft. And you can see kind of getting progressively more constipated as you go up on top of the chart and progressively more loose to diarrhea. So there should be a nice even consistency of stools most of the time. Now there are going to be times where you might get a little dehydrated and have a more solid stool, or eat something a little off and have a little soft blob stool, but most of your stools really should be like a sausage or a snake. And really, ideally, you should have 2 or 3 stools in a day. Not everybody does that, but that is the healthiest thing that we're going to see. Now, the other thing that happens there is you absorb vitamin K from this location, mostly because a lot of your bacteria are in the last stages of the small intestine and in the large intestine. About a third of your fecal weight is bacteria. Gross, but true. And they're the ones that are actually metabolizing the vitamin K and donating that to you. So as a metaphor, the colon is really about, there's some good expressions here. It scared me poopless, or it had me running, or anal retentive. We have a whole bunch of them interesting metaphors for this. But what we'll actually often see is that there's a correlation between like fear syndromes and diarrhea, anxiety syndromes and diarrhea. And it's often part of that second zone where people just overwork, over-deliver dramatically. And so if that's part of your coping strategy, it makes it more likely for you to see some of those things happening. Now, there can also be some marked changes in the microbiome that can contribute to this, because this is the place, where a lot of your microbiome is. And like I said before, I was going to give you a bit of a slide on how dramatic it actually is to your health. And here's just some quotes. The gut microbiome can be viewed as an anaerobic bioreactor programmed to synthesize molecules that direct mammalian immune system, modify the epigenome, and regulate host metabolism. 40% of the circulating metabolites in your blood are from your microorganisms. They contribute dramatically to what you digest and take in and the information that's there. So balanced microflora gives balance in that. Here's another quote by another MAYR, almost the same, but not quite the same. So this man is actually the head of a psychiatric study department at a university. I can't remember which university now. And he basically said he strongly felt the engagement of the gut and its microbiome plays a major role in determining intensity, duration, and uniqueness of emotional feelings. I'm not sure if I would describe all of our feelings to the microbiota, but I've certainly seen people have dramatic changes in mood when the microbiota are normalized. And of course, digestion is crucial to supporting the normal balanced flora. Badly digested stuff ends up feeding bugs that shouldn't be there in great amounts and makes the population balance inappropriate. These things can also be tested. We can test aspects of the microbiome. We can test aspects of the genome of the microbiome to see what kind of organisms are in there and what correlations you might have as a consequence. We've talked about the microbiome in other lectures before in more detail. You can test also the ladder parts of colon function by having the main species plated out on like a microbial growth plate, and just see like what organisms are actually there and if there are any obviously plated out pathogens. So that's part of the comprehensive digestive and stool analysis. We also do breath testing for overgrowth of bacteria in other parts of the GI system. Those are also known as the SIBO test, or the small intestinal bowel overgrowth tests. Now, I thought I'd also just touch on, cramping and gas. So like I said, gas could be produced by the microbiome easily especially if there's a lot there and you get a big carb hit. Bacteria love carbohydrates and they just digest them very well, and they make methane and hydrogen gases with them, and sometimes also sulfide gases. You can get really marked cramps in the colon, like so bad you will drop to your knees. So sometimes people are terrified there's something horribly wrong, but in reality, they're just under a lot of stress, and that shared nervous system with your adrenal and kidney function can actually make the colon spasm so hard that it's a pain that is so markedly painful that it just can really knock people right out. That's where you also often will get cramps followed by diarrhea, and this is a common reaction under stress. You can obviously also get constipation. Now, number one, constipation is how well hydrated are you? And again, you can see miracles happen sometimes just by rehydrating people appropriately and making sure they have the right electrolyte balance, because it's a huge function. There's 10 liters worth of back and forth fluid transfers in a day to make your digestion work. And so that's not to say that you have to drink 10 liters, but you need to have 10 liters available to move. And so if you do a poor job of replacing fluids, you'll always be up against that. Hemorrhoids. I wanted to picture hemorrhoids, and I put up some pictures here because people have some confusion about hemorrhoids. What hemorrhoids really are varicose veins in your rectum, and they're either internal or external. And they're mostly the combination produced by poor liver function, because the portal circulation that plugs into your liver, the most gravity dependent part of that closed loop is your butt. And there's also some systemic circulation that's coming in there, so there's often a lot of pressure in there. If the liver's not doing well, you'll see flares of hemorrhoids. It's also more likely in somebody who has varicose veins in general, where the veins are more distensible. And it can happen with like pushing in pregnancy, or constant constipation where you're pushing very hard and you're actually bulging out those veins. You can tone them up and, like I said, clean up the liver and improve function. And they often calm down dramatically. It's rare that you actually have to do a major intervention for a hemorrhoid, but people have them all the time, so I thought I would mention them. In the colon as well, you can get multiple different conditions. There's a lot of chronic conditions, chronic colitis that you can get. It's basically just inflammations in the colon, and they often have to do with the fact that things have been immunologically triggered, like Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. You can also get some interesting conditions going in the colon, like for an example, polyps. This is what a polyp looks like. They're small. Sometimes they're larger, much larger than this, but they're like these little pedunculated little growths. Usually they're not a big deal, but they can go cancerous. So just if they find a polyp on a colonoscopy, they're generally speaking going to be removed, just to make sure that they don't turn into anything. But they, and given enough time, maybe they will, but they don't always. Diverticulosis is another thing I've seen people get confused about. This is literally where you're getting pouches off the side of the colon. And here you can see a picture where you can see the entrances into those pouches. And so this food and stuff can get stuck in there and create inflammations that are extremely uncomfortable. And this is often associated with other colon inflammations or a chronic constipation state. So now that you've seen pretty much an overview of all these organs, I hope I've convinced you to do the obvious things like chew and sitting down to eat and minimizing your liquids with meals, drinking tons of water between meals, being physically active so you move your guts around a lot, having a great plate proportion like we've seen in previous lectures. We got lots of vegetables and fiber-rich things, being careful with drugs that change bowel function and anticipating that, if you do have to take antibiotics or pain medications. Don't eat when you're stressed out if you can avoid it. Address your stressors like we saw in those 3 zones, and use support instead of force to support your digestion. So that was a lot. I just gave you a lot of information about the digestion, but I hope it just makes you think about it a little bit more, because it is such a complex set of processes, and one step can be so contingent on other steps for completion. It really is a sequence. Now, as we're coming up into we're coming into our final lecture of the 2019-20 webinar series. So we're going to do sleep in March. I'm hoping I'm going to see you all there. Of course, you can register in advance online at wholelifemedicine.com. That's our resource site. Hopefully that's how you got to this one. And here's a preliminary schedule for 2020. I still have a few slots to fill in this plan. So if you have ideas about what topics you'd like, let me know. But these are some of the ones that have gotten suggested as topic areas. So, you know, if you have something brilliant that you want to know more about, by all means, you let me know. And I hope you'll let me know your any of your other questions that came up as a result of this overview. Any questions that you want to give me on the side? I know I've got like at least 20 of you sitting here patiently listening. So if I've got a question, now's your chance. Or if you have a topic that you want to see me do, that'd be great. I was thinking about doing medicinal mushrooms. That's actually on patient request, and redoing detoxification and doing like the food reactions and allergies a lecture this year, and reviewing breast health and period problems, and cleaning out your house so you don't have stuff in your house that's affecting your health. Dealing with menopause and aging. Aging gracefully was also a suggestion. So, oh, Sheena's just asking me about biome testing. Yeah, biome testing is SNP testing for your microbiota. So what that's just telling us is a little bit of information about what the tendencies are going to be given the microbiome balance that you have. So it's interesting information, but I would not bank an entire health strategy on it. It's developing technology. So it's showing correlations, but it's not so well developed that it always has the greatest predictor value to it. It's kind of like our gene testing. So we have gene testing that's similar. It's showing us common variants that have some associations with disease factors, but it's not the same as like having the full book of you, because there's only so many things that we know what they are and what they're doing. So we're really limited by that. And we're limited by technology of like what genes we can actually, like I said, identify. So it's unfortunate because really our genetic, although genetics has come a long way, and technology has come a long way in genetics, even since I went to university, it's not as positively predictive as you might think. How long should you wait after meals to start drinking water? I would say it's best to drink the water before meals, 20 minutes before, and then wait about, an hour and a half, 2 hours afterwards, depending on how thirsty you are, if you can. If you're dying of thirst, please, by all means, drink a glass of water. But if you can just give it a little bit of time to kind of settle. Usually the stomach will mostly empty in about 2 to 3 hours, maximum 4 if you ate something pretty proteinish and you didn't chew well. Bloating in the abdomen, the swelling discomfort is actually usually can be caused by 2 things. Either you've got trapped gas in a section of the small intestine where it can't really easily go up or down, or the guts themselves are swollen. If you have kind of like the kind of bloating that happens suddenly, it's usually to do with having too much bacteria too high up in your gut. And normally that has to do with overeating and overeating a lot of carbohydrates that aren't getting digested in time. It's, again, can also be part of just the digestive process. So yeah, sorry, Angela, if that's in the small intestine. So do you have any suggestions about food order or consumption for maximizing? No, because I personally think, like, I've seen the food combining things in the past. I mean, there was a window there where everybody was doing food combining. The reality is your system is designed to work sequentially on combinations of foodstuffs. And so I think sometimes if you notice that certain foods are aggravating and you try and separate them out, you'll just find that that's easy. Technically, that's easier on your digestion, but it would be really difficult to get the full digestive response by not having like the stimulation of all of the food categories in something. So I think instead of thinking about it as doing things in sequence, you should think about maximizing the digestion, and you really should be able to get everything out of all the categories, as opposed to trying to separate it out. There's certain categories of foods that actually just are harder to digest. They're harder to digest energetically. Plants actually are quite hard to digest, especially with poor digestion. This is one of the reasons when people have really bad digestion, the vegetables screw them up the most. Even though everybody knows it's healthy to eat your vegetables, somehow a steak can feel substantially better, unless you have really poor stomach acid, in which case a steak doesn't feel very good at all. But for the vast majority of people, they'll notice vegetables more, like raw vegetables or cruciferous vegetables, where they just don't have all the forces in their digestion to really do a great job of it. You know, it's in about 2 weeks, I'm actually doing a lecture for the Anthroposophic Health Association. That's the group of therapy associations that lectures to the public about anthroposophic medicine. And maybe I'll send around the link to register for that, because we're actually going to talk in that lecture about the energy side of digestion and why certain foodstuffs are, like, what kind of interaction a human being actually has with the various foodstuffs. You know, so talking about vegetarian diets and vegan diets and dairy in the context of the inner forces of a human being. So that's a different discussion. It's more anthroposophic in nature. So we're talking more about the soul and the spirit and the etheric forces in the physical body. But if any of you are interested in that, it's a very different way of coming at it. And often, you know, we use those kind of remedies when we deal with your digestive problems in clinic. But I think it's an interesting way of like taking a renewed look at how you might perceive digestion. So vegetables are difficult to digest. They take a lot of your inner forces to digest. But they're also engage you in a way that foodstuffs that are higher up in the food chain don't. So this is one of the reasons why in esoteric circles, vegetarian diets are encouraged. And it's actually because it forces you to physically handle things by improving your inner forces through your own development. So if that's not kind of where your head is, you know, it's hard to kind of go there, but in more esoteric circles, this is one of the reasons why this is touted. Now, this is not always 100% appropriate for everybody all of the time, because, you know, at different times of life, you're going to need different kinds of dietary strategies, potentially, depending on how much stress you're under or what your condition is like, or, you know, maybe you've had many shocks to the system, or things that have happened to you that decrease the other forces. I mean, that's totally reasonable to change your diet. It worries me when people get a little monomanic about their diets and they're very rigid about what they're eating, because there are times where you need to be more flexible for your own health. So yeah, Angela, if you're seeing veggies are bloating, it just means you've got a lot on your plate, and you know there might be some forces that just need a little bit of shoring up there. And maybe there's also the possibility of needing to really kind of look at how much you're eating. You know, we're all taught to do 3 meals and 2 snacks a day. Frankly, I don't think that's good. Please don't do that unless you're dying for like a snack. I think we just overeat. We're just over undernourished and under digestion. And are smoothies and blended soups easier for digestion? To a degree they are, because you're doing some of the mechanical digesting yourself. Eating late at night affects the digestion in the sense that you're not upright for the first stages, and so you're not well into the digestive processes before you go to bed. And so that can be disturbing both to your sleep and just, kind of delay your digestion a little bit. It's not the normal timing for it. And so where you should be kind of more fully at rest in the sleeping period, you're not. I mean, it's not going to screw you up permanently or anything like that. I don't want you to get that idea. And like we were saying, in salivating those soups, like really tasting them and swishing around in your mouth, and not treating them like a beverage, because they're not beverages. Smoothies are food. And you probably should take smaller smoothies than the average person. I've seen people with huge smoothie jars, and that is just a lot for your digestion to handle, because it has to deal with all the microscopic stuff that's still raw, right? Okay, we're at an hour and a half, so I'm going to say goodnight, and hopefully, if you have other questions, like I said, you just let us know on Facebook, and hopefully some of you will also have some ideas about what to do this year in terms of topics. So blessings to you all. Thank you so much for showing up. I always like to say just thank you. You guys are the best patients and visitors, if I don't know you, ever. I really appreciate you all. Okay, good night. Thanks for watching. I love to connect to my patient community to inform and inspire, and I hope you'll join us again in the near future. Don't forget to check out whole-life-medicine.com for more webinars and events.